Perspective versus directive. We as a species have been moved and directed most of our existence. That's not our fault, it's just hardwired into our ecosystem. But what I'm presenting is that the argument of perspective over directive would make more of an impact. See, you no longer have to constantly direct or follow the directive of reality. You can now adjust your perspective to fit what you like most about it, in turn developing more of a smooth path for you to experience and learn. Doesn't mean things get easier, it just means you evolved to a point where you can shift an angle and just see a totally different picture. I've been trying to find a way to explain this idea for a really long time. You have perspective, the idea of shifting your point of perspective, point of whatever you want to call it. And then you have the directive, where you're following this river that everybody's following and it's kind of just pushing you wherever. First, let me explain why directive no longer works. As you can see, our world is shifting fairly quickly. So what you can do is observe why it's shifting. It's because we as a species have fought over the concept of a directive. We've been trying to fight over whose directive is accurate and right. But if you look at the dominating factor, the perspective, you realize that all directives are virtually the same. It's just a matter of obtaining and accomplishing said goal with the directive. That means the person's way of achieving the goal may be different, but the end goal is virtually sustainability in life. So, in an evolutionary sense, it makes no plausible sense to perceive in that way anymore. This doesn't mean we get rid of authority. No, this means we shift the perspective as a collective and move in a way where it benefits the planet. So if the directive is not at its apex, trying to benefit the entire world as a whole, is it truly valuable? That's why I've been thinking about this construct of perspective over directive, and it makes so much sense now. We're coming into an age of seeing, sights, recognition, information. These things all have to do with perspective instead of directive. And online there are so many influencers trying to push their directive, and it makes no sense in the grand scheme of things. Because the end goal at the end of the day is for everyone to get home safely and prosperously. So you look at the fundamental difference between the two things. We have evolved from a species where we no longer adhere to directive. It makes no sense. The point is that the perspective must be broadened so that we can move in a singular direction. I know there's going to be plenty of people who will disregard this completely. But for people who know how to shift waves and tides, this is for you. If you notice, the people with a massive following and a massive impact on society usually have this exact concept embedded into their teachings. The perspective they pursue is virtually more important than the directive that they're trying to push. Because it's the perspective that allows a person to see the paths they can take, versus the directive just pushing them down the avenue. And after years of just contemplating this idea without any sense of title for it, it's finally come to my attention that the directive is unknown. So let me ask you something. You have an apple that's half distorted, and it's the only thing left on the planet to eat. It's half distorted and it's half perfect. Are you going to push yourself to the fruit in the distorted perspective, or are you going to turn the apple to a better way to look at the apple and eat it that way? In other words, are you going to eat the apple from the angle where it's distorted, or are you going to eat the apple from the angle where it's okay to eat? Keep in mind, if you push away the distorted part for someone else to eat, that may be all there is for them to eat. And then guess what? Both of you guys have nothing but distorted apple to eat. Because one individual will suddenly point out that the apple is distorted and foul, while you, looking from one angle, will see it otherwise. It is always perspective over directive, because the perspective can prevent things from happening before they even happen. A directive faces them regardless. A skilled person would prevent scenarios from taking place, versus a barbarian who pushes right through it and loses assets. I trust you have a brain, like most people do, and humbly I present to you this concept. To understand this, you have to base your reality more based on a perspective-dominant field of vision. You can move your perspective to an angle where it helps. The optimal perspective that's able to shift perspectives the fastest automatically gains the upper hand of any scenario, because a directive pushing object ends up as a robot scooping up oil to keep itself alive. Like the art piece Can't Help Myself. It is a directive acting robot that changes directions to scoop blood or oil back to itself that looks like blood, just to keep itself alive and running. Now let's switch the flip on it. If it were a perspective shifting robot, it would easily find the proper perspective to take all the oil back, because the directive is no longer the problem. This is ultimately the only way to sustain everything on this planet. The perspective must outweigh the directive every single time. And if the directive is not as valuable as the perspective, there is nothing gained from any situation or scenario. In fact, I think you would be losing more if you dominated directive versus having a broader perspective about the situation. Not to say directive is a bad thing or person. I think directive is a great thing. But to have an ecosystem where society bases its means and ends by directive alone is nonsense. It's nonsense. It doesn't make a lick of sense. Yep. That's it. Perspective versus directive.